Today's discussion is on the state of early childhood. It is our second featured session of the 2021 conference, and we're so glad to have many of you back and some of you attending one of these 90-minute sessions for the first time. So welcome. I'm Amy Cubbage, president of the North Carolina Partnership for Children, and we are glad to have you with us to dive more deeply into issues that are facing children and families across North Carolina that policymakers are grappling with pre-pandemic, but certainly today in 2021, heightened awareness. During our last featured session last week, we discussed the needs and strategies and resources in rural communities across North Carolina. And then next week on May 27th, we'll explore ways to support and the needs and crises that are ongoing, but again, with a focus on the current state of affairs with the pandemic on the early childhood education workforce. And today we're going to engage in a bipartisan discussion about early childhood policy and the policy landscape and learn from experts about opportunities and trends at both the state and federal levels. We know that children, families, and those support them have faced unprecedented challenges over the last year, but the infusion of federal relief funds and the renewed focus on the importance of early childhood and childcare and finding a new way to do it that's sustainable for the workforce, for providers, for families, and most importantly for children is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And it's an opportunity to strengthen access to care, to build and support the early care and education workforce, and again, to really focus on support to families and what works for them. In fact, today, Education Secretary Miguel Cardona is in North Carolina, and he will tour a pre-K site in the state and meet with early educators in the conversation around the American Families Plan, the excitement and collaboration around that, as well as other federal initiatives and state interest is very encouraging. So wanting the best future for our next generation of children is something we certainly all agree on. It is bipartisan. I'm filled with hope as I hear conversations happening about that, and politics being left out in many of those conversations is incredibly exciting and something that we definitely bring from Smart Start. So as we approach this moment and these opportunities, we also take a new look at the policies and think about how they can expand and how they can in particular expand and be centered on equity. And that means truly living in at Smart Start and for all of us in the early childhood field to walking the talk. When we say each child, we mean each child in every community, and understanding that investments in early childhood programs reduce barriers to success for all. So I'm very pleased to welcome our panel of leaders who I'm lucky enough to call my friends. They bring a variety of perspectives and experiences and deep understanding of the issues of early childhood. I look forward to learning from them and hearing this important discussion. And I'm thrilled and would ask you to join me in welcoming our moderator for today, Liz Bell. She's the early childhood reporter at Education NC. And all of us have been so fortunate to have her in the state reporting and focused on early childhood, bringing her expertise, and know we all benefit from that. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that context and that introduction. And thank you, Smart Start, for inviting me to moderate this important discussion at a critical moment around the needs of young children and families in North Carolina and across our country, and how early childhood policy can better meet those needs. As Amy mentioned, this session this morning brings together policy leaders for a bipartisan discussion about North Carolina's early childhood landscape. And our panelists today, thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise with us this morning. They will both be touching on kind of the current legislative and policy outlook at the state and federal level, as well as future opportunities for growth and sustainability and equity. Thanks to everyone listening and joining for their interest and engagement in these important and complex issues. If you have questions throughout, please drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. We are holding time at the end of our discussion today to hopefully get to some of those questions. So please don't be shy. I'd love to just dive right in. To get us started, if each of our panelists could briefly introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about the work you do in early childhood. Ariel, could you kick us off, please?
Yeah, thank you. Hey, everybody. It's so great to be here. Ariel Ford, Director for the Division of Child Development and Early Education here in North Carolina. So this agency oversees the Child Care Development Fund, our North Carolina pre-kindergarten state program, child care licensing, child care subsidy, and then partner across our state with the amazing folks at Smart Start, Child Care Resource and Referral, our child care health consultants, our advocacy community, our child care community, to make sure that our system is well informed and that it is listening to the needs of those who are most impacted by our decisions. I am a North Carolina native. I was born and raised in Buncombe County, so I have become a Flatlander, much to the chagrin of my family, but just really proud to be back in my home state and working on policies to help the field that I grew up in. So thanks for having me here today, everybody.
Dan, do you want to go next?
Happy to. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Liz and Amy and Smart Start for the invitation to be here today. My name is Dan Wuori. I am the Senior Director of Early Learning at the Hunt Institute, which you, as a North Carolina audience, may know was the brainchild of our founder and current and longstanding chairman, former Governor Jim Hunt, who was the four-term governor of North Carolina. The Institute is located in Cary and obviously has a special place in its heart for North Carolina, but we work at the national level as well. We support governors, state lawmakers, and other state senior elected leaders on issues of education policy. We really cover the full education continuum from prenatal and early childhood, which is my focus at the Institute, through K-12 education and higher ed and workforce as well.
Celia?
Hi, it's so great to see everyone this morning. My name is Cecilia Sims. I am a senior policy advisor to Senator Richard Burr from the home state of North Carolina. He's the ranking member on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, shortly called HELP. And we've got jurisdiction over most of the child care issues, as well as child abuse, and a whole array of things. This is actually my second stint with Richard. I've recently come back to the Senate. I worked for Richard initially when he was first elected to the Senate and got into child care. Early on, that's where I met Susan Perry. Susan Perry and Linda Smith, then of NACRA, introduced to Richard and to me the need to build in a federal base for health and safety in the child care subsidy program. And that was our first entree into it. And I've come back to, after doing about 8 years at KinderCare, where I got to look at a number of child care systems across the country. And I'm really glad to be back. I am a native of North Carolina, grew up in Winston-Salem. I now live in Texas. Don't hold that against me, but to show you my true bona fides of still being a North Carolinian, we are the proud owners of a Plot Hound who is forever with us in Houston. So good to be with you all.
Thank you all for being with us this morning. We obviously have some great insights at both the state and federal level. We all know the last year has been challenging for young children and families with not as many children in formal early learning environments, families experiencing loss, different kinds of trauma, financial and food insecurity. As we come out of the pandemic, what are the major needs of young children and families that are at the top of you all's minds and that are driving your policy work in this moment? Ariel, could we start with you again?
That's a big question, Liz. It's been a big year and one that no one could have dreamed of or prepared for. And I think, what comes to mind for me is that in North Carolina, we really held fast to our system. So there was quick, decisive action by DCDEE and by DHHS and by our governor. So our child care programs over the course of the last year, 54 have returned their licenses, but 199 have opened up, and that includes 59 homes. So we've really seen that our early care and education system has held. Is it strained? Yes, absolutely, but it has held. And I really contribute that to the decades of investment in North Carolina, that there is a Smart Start system that has local supports for childcare programs across the state, that has local supports for families across the state, that we have a strong regulatory system, that we have strong connections to both community and policymakers. And I think, something that we can't ignore is that this pandemic has put taken a toll on social and emotional health for adults and children alike. There is literally not one person in this whole world who has not been impacted by the pandemic. And so there are a host of ways that we have built resiliency into our system. And so everything from the federal government, and Celia, I won't steal the thunder of but having supports for families, financial supports for families, the moratorium on evictions that happened so quickly. And for our child care centers and our teachers and our families, the supports were around how do we stabilize the child care industry from a business perspective? How do we make sure that we provide stipends or bonus pay for teachers? And then how do we create financial relief for families? And so that came in multiple ways. So we allowed families to stay home with children if they were on subsidy. We halted our subsidy regulations around attendance and enrollment for I think about 5 months, paid co-pays to our child care program, so no one was losing any money, and families that were out of work because of the pandemic didn't have to take on that burden. And then for our small businesses, we were able to provide operational grants to make sure that those fixed costs and basic operating needs were met, including PPE. The state stepped in and ordered PPE for a period of time to use our buying power. And so all of those resiliency factors, in addition to the social and emotional trauma-informed trainings that we partnered with our Smart Start agencies to provide for teachers and for families, I think have led us to a place where we're prepared for recovery. We are in a strong position as we move out of the pandemic, and we can build on some of the flexibilities that we had through the pandemic around families, teachers, and our childcare programs. So I don't know that I've ever been as hopeful as I have been today for our field. It's a really powerful moment for us to be in. We have learned a lot about what we can do and how strong we are. The system is strong and it does work. So I'm eager to move forward with all of the ways that we can support children, families, teachers, and businesses.
Amazing. Dan, would you like to go next, just around, I guess what needs in this moment that young children and families are facing are you hearing, and how is that driving the work you do right now?
Absolutely. I think, Liz, the good news is that what children need right now is very much what young children need all the time, and what I think the early childhood field is so well equipped to provide. They need social emotional sorts of supports. I know you mentioned all of the many different categories of loss that families around the country have experienced over the past year, whether it's sort of directly the loss of a loved one to the pandemic, or loss of work or opportunity within their families, a loss of access to loved ones, the opportunity to interact and even just to hug their grandparents in some cases. So the list goes on and on. I think as you referenced in the kind of the setup to the question as well, what we have seen across the country is that over the past year, that access to or maybe not access to, but accessing of group-based early childhood programs, whether that's kindergarten, where school districts across the country have seen very dramatic declines in the numbers of kids enrolled. The same, certainly holds true for state pre-K programs, for childcare programs. So, one of the things that I think young children are going to need right now is lots of love and understanding, particularly as they're heading back into these group-based settings. I think teachers will need to recognize that children may not have had certain experiences over the past year, and in particular, those may be social emotional sorts of experiences in terms of opportunity to work with with peers and to share and to interact. But those are things that the early childhood field deals with every day, all year. And so I think, we need kind of what we're good at, only maybe a little bit more of it, even during this time. I think, more broadly and systemically, what families need and what the pandemic has shed such great light on is the need for equitable access to high quality childcare. I think the pandemic has really laid bare a lot of the underlying weaknesses within the nation's childcare systems. Childcare is a very difficult industry. It is, something where parents are literally paying as much as they can, where providers are scraping by on absolutely razor thin profit margins, and frankly, the whole thing is subsidized on the backs of the workforce, who are in large numbers women of color. Who are helping to make childcare affordable in the form of unsustainably low wages. And I think that is something that the pandemic has really highlighted. I think like Ariel mentioned, from a policy perspective, I am as encouraged as I've been in a long time, because I think we've spent the past year and a half or so looking at this constant drumbeat of newspaper articles and a discussion around the needs of the early childhood workforce in particular. And so I'm really hopeful. We've seen providers kind of lifted up as first responders, even sort of alongside emergency medical personnel. That's a place of respect that candidly this field hasn't always received. And so I'm hopeful that the past year and a half has really lifted up those needs. But I think the proof is in the pudding, as they say, and that now's the time for us as a nation and in individual states to really act to address some of those underlying weaknesses that I think the pandemic has just made so clear to all of us.
Thank you. Celia, do you have anything to add just as far as what's on the top of your mind at the federal level around meeting children and families' needs at this moment?
As just piggyback a little on what Ariel said. I think throughout the pandemic, what we've seen, like the things that come to mind of what we need most and need to continue is parents need the flexibility, they need flexible care, they need reliable care, and providers need stability. And all of those pieces are critical to making it work. What we've also seen, though, is that while there were, to be sure, and there are inherent weaknesses in the current system also has some inherent strengths that we want to build upon and not destroy and create something completely anew. We need a lot, additional money. That's a given. That there's not been enough investment in this field. But the fact that of all the education sectors, childcare was the one that has been the most reliable for families over the last year is something that the childcare sector and every childcare teacher and director should be honored for, is they stepped in and continued in the face of the greatest period of uncertainty to be there for young children and their families day in and day out, to be that person who was there to comfort that child when mom or dad or whatever the family structure had to go to work. And that's, that resiliency is there. And what we need is the financial support and the, to build upon the flexibilities, the greater flexibilities to go forward. But I'm like Ariel, and I think with Dan, I mean, it's a very optimistic time in this field. I think, the other beauty of what happened the last year is I think the field for the last 2 decades has been often ashamed to use the word childcare. For some reason, like we got ourselves in this, like, well, if we just change the term, that's somehow going to like fix the policy issue. And the thing is, childcare is the term that parents understand and the general public understands. And if anything that's come out positive in this pandemic is people now fully understand the importance, the critical importance of childcare for families. People cannot work without childcare, and parents want something more than just plopping their child in front of a television. They expect not just health and safety, but developmentally, strengthening curriculum and activities throughout the day. So there's still a lot of questions to be answered, but and I think the best place I've ever seen this field from a policy perspective to make true significant change for providers, families, and children.
Thank you all for kind of grounding our conversation in the needs of children and families, and for your optimism. I'd love to kind of get into the weeds of, what that optimism could mean. We in North Carolina are receiving quite a large sum of money going to stabilize and strengthen childcare programs. How can that funding be most impactful in the short term? And how do we ensure those investments are sustainable, since this is one-time money that we're speaking about from the American Rescue Plan? Dan, do you want to kick us off?
I'm happy to, Liz. And that is really the big conversation right now, not only in North Carolina, but really in states all across the country. The American Rescue Plan supplemented what was provided in the earlier CARES Act. The CARES Act provided $3.5 billion to help scaffold and sustain childcare businesses around the country. But the American Rescue Plan bumps that up to the neighborhood of $40 billion. So it's a very large amount of money that is going out to the states. And I think you sort of framed the question in exactly the way that states are thinking through this right now. On the short-term basis, clearly the thing that states can do and that North Carolina can do, most immediately is ensure the sustainability of childcare businesses themselves. The pandemic has been catastrophic for the childcare industry. I do think that, the CARES Act came at a very opportune time and really managed, even though it at the time was seen as sort of less than the industry needed long term, was probably just the right Band-Aid to make sure. We heard early on in the pandemic these estimates that 40 or 50% or more of childcare businesses could simply shut their doors permanently, based on as I mentioned in the earlier question, it's a difficult economic model for providers even under the best of circumstances. And so as providers across the country, we're dealing with things like emergency orders closing childcare in many of the states, or limiting classroom capacity due to public health concerns. The economic model, as weak as it was to begin with, really began to collapse. I think we have evidence that providers really tapped into every possible bit of savings and into personal resources. So many childcare businesses are kind of small family-run businesses, and I think we've heard of providers running up their credit cards and taking out loans, and just really doing everything that they could. But the CARES Act money came through at just the right time, and by and large the states used that for a couple of different categories, but the most prominent of which has been sustainability grants to providers. So that we used those federal funds sort of backstop, even the sustainability of the businesses, so that, ideally, once we came to this point of starting to emerge a little bit from the pandemic, the childcare hadn't disappeared. I think in a fair number of cases it has, unfortunately, but not nearly as catastrophically as I think we were projecting. And again, the CARES Act dollars were at just the right time. So I think, as the states now tackle this new question of how to expend $40 billion, job number one is to sustain really what the CARES Act enabled, which was the continued operation of childcare centers during a time that that they've experienced hardship and frankly are continuing to experience hardship. I think we have seen, as I mentioned, a shift away from a kind of group-based care. I think maybe that's starting to rebound a bit, but I think understandably some apprehension around putting young children into group-based settings, especially earlier on in the pandemic. So the field is really recovering. We have to make sure that those sorts of sustainability grants continue. On the longer term, that's the real challenge. I think I think everybody is pretty much in agreement. We need to continue sustainability. The longer term question, though, of how this amazing windfall of resources can be used really to the greatest benefit and to the greatest betterment of systems is something that I can tell you for certain from working with many states across the country that many are struggling with right now, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, which is that this is, at least for now, one-time funding that has gone out to the states. And so, for example, I mean, one of the things we recognize is that the needs of the early childhood workforce are so vast. They are so undercompensated, and it is so unjust and inequitable and frankly just a complete mismatch compared to the importance of their work. But understandably, states are reluctant to use one-time funding to try to step in and support that. I think there are states, though, that are taking some innovative approaches and are looking at things like how to incentivize. There are several states that are looking, for example, at using those sustainability grants, but sort of tiering them in a way that there's a basic grant that maybe they got through the CARES Act, but if you are a center that pays your teachers at X number of dollars per hour, then maybe you move up to the next level of that grant. And if you pay still a higher level, that there's a third tier. And so states are looking at things like that. They're looking at things like expanding things like North Carolina's own wages program for salary supplements. So states are really looking, but I think kind of struggling through right now. What's the best way to handle these long-term issues like compensation using what are ultimately right now one-time dollars.
Ariel, do you have any thoughts or priorities that North Carolina is looking at right now, and the division is looking at as far as, the strategies that strike that balance between boosting, making investments for the short term that strengthen care and education and also can be built upon in the future?
Yeah. And I think people like me are kind of in the hot seat for this question, and it is an important moment for states to be bold and be brave and be really smart. So I think there is this tension between how much can we do, where's that edge, and how much can we push into that edge. I will say that my very first boss, when I moved into nonprofit work, said it's always one-year money. There is no such thing as anything but one-year money when you're working in grants and public funding. And so I kind of keep that in my mind, and that in no way means that you get to be cavalier about choices, but just to also recognize we didn't know that the world would be this way a year from now. I mean, we went home and we all kind of thought, oh, this is going to be 2 or 3 weeks and we'll be back at the office, right? And so here we are 15 months later, which is to say nobody has a crystal ball. Dan mentioned all of the kind of critical components. Most importantly, maybe, I don't want to say most importantly, but we are at a nexus around the workforce, and how do we support highly educated, qualified educators to stay in the field, retain their employment. And it is a compensation issue. It is not an education issue. It is a compensation issue. And that's just something that states, including North Carolina, are grappling with and have to grapple with. More specifically to your point, investing in people is always a long-term strategy. When you invest in people, you are investing in a long-term payout. I am that person. You know, I got childcare wages. I used Teach to get my credential. I was invested in by the early childhood system in North Carolina. And so that's the kind of investments I think we should be making. The other thing that we can talk about later on is that the business model has to be invested in. I mean, there are certainly broken pieces around the financing, but there's also ways in which states and programs have an opportunity to really modernize data collection systems, you know, create efficiencies with technology. And our field has just, because we have been kind of falsely suppressed for so long, that kind of data infrastructure or technology infrastructure is on the cusp, you know, and so this is a moment where we could just catapult ourselves into the 21st century with that. So those are things that we're thinking closely about, and obviously making sure that those businesses are stable, that they are here to provide care for children and families over the long haul, and that families are able to access it. And I will just share that I got an email from a parent day before yesterday, and she put in the email, she said, I'm gonna maybe I'm a crier. So she said, I knew through the pandemic, I knew I could drop my daughter off and that she was as safe with her teacher as she was with me. And that's what we do in our field. We keep children safe. We make sure that they have what they need to develop and grow and learn. And every teacher, every owner, every director, y'all did that for families throughout the pandemic. So every one of you should be proud. I know you're tired. And the rescue plan is a down payment. It's a down payment on what we need to do long-term, and we can use it to catapult ourselves forward. I have no doubts about that. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. It's what people have worked for 30 years to bring to fruition. And so there is no excuse for states to be hesitant or cheap in this moment. The money is here to stabilize our industry and to bring us forward. That's what we hope to be able to do in North Carolina.
Thank you for that. I want to kind of keep us rolling and moving forward because we got a lot of great questions, and we'll start with you, Celia, for this next question. Around, you know, we've got the American Rescue Plan. Now we're going to shift to the American Families Plan, which is just proposed right now, has not been passed or anything, but it's obviously creating a lot of buzz in the early childhood field around pre-K proposals, more child care assistance for families, and could present a potential large opportunity for early care and education. What is the outlook for the plan? What should we be watching for as you know, kind of North Carolina nerds? Can you provide us some insight into what we should be looking for on the federal level going forward? And if you want to also weave in, you know, some thoughts around the American Rescue Plan and using those investments smartly as well, that'd be great.
Sure. So I don't have a crystal ball, and I cannot tell you what's actually going to happen. What is clear right now is that, as you see, there's a great deal of excitement around the issue. So you see multiple plans being thrown out there. How everything will shake out is unknown. I do think there's going to be a significant investment, you know, in childcare early ed, but how that's going to look is what the big unknown is. I think from the policy thing, from the federal level, and what I'm, you know, looking at, there is this great deal of excitement, but we also need to think smartly about the policies we do going forward, because with this amount of money, if you do it wrong, you can set the stage for decades of doing wrong. I mean, just like that childcare got underinvested, you know, wasn't fully thought out years ago and was kind of treated like a shoestring budget. That really kind of held us back because we didn't think about a lot of things. And while I think my biggest concern right now of all the plans out there, I will be honest, I love 4-year-olds. They're great, but I also love infants, toddlers, 2s and 3s. And I worry with a lot of the conversation going on that we run the risk of further bifurcating the 0 to 5 continuum. And that has lots of implications financially for providers because the 0 to 3 space is exceedingly more expensive because it takes more adults given the care and supervision needs of younger children. But it's also, I mean, children need continuity of care. And you know, we don't need to, I worry about us creating a system that like we're moving young children because of a policy, you know, an artificial policy versus what is in the best interest of an individual child. And I think North has a rich mixed delivery system. Obviously through the pandemic, I think in North Carolina in particular, we learned our family child care area was under-resourced and we didn't have enough availability. We need to figure out how to lift that up and build that. But it's a rich array of quality providers thanks to a very long-term investment in QRIS in the state, continued focus on licensed care. And so how do we build out with the policies that we have? Again, building on what we do, which is giving parents the choices to make for their children, which may be one choice they make for one child and a different choice for another, because no 2 children are the same and they don't develop in exactly the same time frame. And then how we build systems that allow providers financially to meet the flexible needs that parents have. And that's to me, you know, like where we're kind of watching, but like where we end up, I don't know. Other than I do think it's very likely that there's going to be more investment in this field. And what I ask of everyone looking at it is don't get caught up in the number. The number is important, but we have to get the policies right and not make a bad decision. I mean, there's always, when you make a new policy, there are going to be unintended consequences. None of us can see fully in the future, but how we try to mitigate the fewest of those in the future to ensure that we're building, you know, strongly going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard also in recent conversations with Dan, the devil is in the details has been a phrase that he has used a couple of times. Here in North Carolina, the long-running Leandro lawsuit that established the state's constitutional obligation to provide every child with a sound basic education has been a topic of great discussion for some time, and particularly recently with the remedial plan. What is the outlook for the early childhood recommendations in that plan? We can start with Ariel. And I'm also wondering if Dan or Celia have any perspectives about how other states have approached these kinds of lawsuits and resulting plans.
Yeah, I think, you know, I feel like Celia teed me up for this. So thinking about how you use policy to make long-term investments and trying to be thoughtful about what are they unintended consequences or just consequences that we kind of ignored or were blind to. And so I think Leandro has given us a lot of preparedness for this moment, honestly. And so just to back up and share for folks who might not know, so in 1994, 5 school districts sued the state of North Carolina, saying that the state was not meeting their constitutional obligation to provide a sound and basic education for the children in their communities, which was different from children in other wealthier communities having a sound and basic education. And as happens in America, that fell pretty squarely along race and class lines. So 20 years later, well, let me back up and say, very early on, Judge Manning, who was presiding over the case, recognized the importance of early childhood education and early childhood services to a sound and basic education, which was a game changer because typically that has been seen as a K-12 work, scope of work. Judge Manning said, no, what we know in North Carolina is that it starts way before a child enters kindergarten. It starts at birth. So early childhood was very early on added to the Leandro case. So in, fast forward 20 plus years, the court order stated that the plan must address a system of early education that provides access to high quality pre-kindergarten and early childhood learning opportunities to ensure that all students at risk of educational failure, regardless of where they live in the state, enter kindergarten on track for school success. So fast forward again, DCDEE, DHHS, and Governor's Office and DPI have been working together to develop this plan. And for early childhood, it centers around a set of recommendations to be executed by 2028. And so those include expanding the NC pre-kindergarten program, the state pre-K program, to meet 75% of all eligible children in each county. So what's important about that is that we're not saying at a state level, you can have 75% of eligible kids enrolled, because that could look like our urban centers make that happen and our rural communities don't have access or equitable access. So I think that's a really important part, and that's one of those devils in the detail. At a state level, we might look great, but how does it look in Halifax County, right? So I think that's important. Increase high quality early learning opportunities for children from birth. So Celia, Judge Manning pushed us to say, no ma'am, no sir, it is not going to start at 4 years old. You're going to back it up to birth, because that's when we need to start investing in children. And that's where our system starts in early childhood. Thirdly, expand and improve access to individualized early intervention services and support to families with eligible children birth to age 3. Early intervention, we know, works. It is the most important time to intervene, and we need to make whole that system so that children have easy access. So that was an identified component. Fourthly, scale up Smart Start. So Smart Start was started in the 90s, and it has never been funded to meet the intended goal or the potential of Smart Start. And what Smart Start does differently than an early education or childcare system is that it also includes family supports. It is locally based, so it meets the needs of an individual community, and it is specifically birth to 5. Increase the volume and quality of early childhood educator pipeline. So we also recognize the magic is in the teacher. So we need to have teachers that want to be in a 2-year-old. I was a 2-year-old teacher, so I'm a little biased. We need to have teachers who want to be in a 2-year-old room, know what 2-year-olds need, know the developmental progressions, when to be concerned and refer them to early intervention. And then finally, ensure that there are transitions and alignment from early childhood into kindergarten through 3rd grade classrooms, that early elementary setting. And that needs to have both a state level focus and a local level focus, because the rubber meets the road in your community. So we're super committed to all these goals because it is what will make the early childhood system whole. There are dollar amounts attached to all of these. This is not an unfunded mandate. We can't do it without funding. And the governor's budget, his state budget, and his American Rescue Plan draft budget that was released yesterday are really framed toward these Leandro recommendations. So how do we make sure that people have access to childcare? How do we make sure that the pipeline is strong? How do we make sure that Smart Start is funded? And how do we ensure that children who have disabilities have access to services, and their families do too? So I think we have all the pieces that we need to make whole the early childhood system, including the financing, the dollars that need to have this happen. And so now it's really time to make it work. So we need to get dollars appropriated, and we need to start getting programs executed. It challenges us to set aside silos, longstanding silos, to set aside what's a child care responsibility versus a school district's responsibility. And this says, I'm going to speak a little flippantly, but it basically, what I hear the court saying is, I don't care. It's about how you serve children. Make it happen. And we are taking that into account. We work with our DPI colleagues regularly, weekly, to make sure that we are aligning and supporting transitions, that we are providing aligned services, especially for children with disabilities and for social and emotional supports with pyramid models. So I think, like I said at the beginning, Celia teed me up to say the policy matters. I feel really, really, really confident in the Leandro plan and how we move forward with that. And now we have some dollars at the federal level, and hopefully we'll get some allocations at the state level to make lasting changes.
Thank you for kind of diving into those details and those recommendations.
I'm passionate, so.
I know, so just so we respect our time reserved at the end for some of these questions that are coming in, please feel free to continue dropping your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. You guys have mentioned throughout this discussion that the pandemic has highlighted the need to better support the early childhood educator workforce. What are some promising strategies here in North Carolina? I know you guys have started to mention the wage salary supplements. What are some promising strategies to fundamentally deal with these workforce issues of low pay and high turnover, and lack of health insurance? I could go on and on. How do we kind of not put band-aids over those issues, but fundamentally strengthen the workforce going forward? Celia, if you'd like to share your thoughts first.
I mean, the workforce is I think the stickiest wicket probably inside of the childcare issue. I mean, as Dan, I think, spoke earlier, childcare educators aren't paid well because people don't want to pay them well. It is because of the financing system we have and the business model where you run on super low margins. And when 70+% of your budget is on just wages, there's just not a lot of room, and there's only so much you can ask parents to pay because they're paying the most they can pay, and there's just not a lot left over. Obviously, I think through the pandemic, seeing some of the states, like what North Carolina did with the bonuses, was critical. Like, how do you scale that going forward, and how do you set it up in a way that is sustainable? And that is the biggest, I think when I talk to state administrators right now, the thing they are most trying to grapple with, because you don't want to set up a situation where you use one-time money, raise salaries up, and then that money disappears, and 2 years later, the last thing you want to talk about some really bad retention policy, tell people you're cutting their pay is several dollars an hour, and they will be gone in 5 seconds. That said, I think there are, also with the workforce, I think as Ariel said, it's not an undereducated, it is an underpaid workforce. But we also know we have a lot of folks in the workforce who have some college but no degree, and that's not just at a 4-year or 2-year. And I think often we've thought about how do we deal with the early childhood workforce from the early childhood perspective only, and not fully integrating, having the conversation with higher ed. There's a lot of play. North Carolina's done a better job than a lot of others of how do we set it up that's feasible for an early childhood workforce to go back to school and finish a degree. They have a lot of experience, but may not want or have the time to sit in a class. So how do we make better use of competency-based assessments, prior learning assessments, those pieces to move people along a continuum? And then if we can pair it with programs like wages and teach that you have in North Carolina to give the financial incentive both to the individual to go forth, but for the provider to reward them with a higher wage in the future for having attained that. But it's going to take everyone at the table on this. And this is one place, trying to deal with the wage issue without pumping additional consistent dollars into the system is really an impossibility. It just, it has to be not just one-time money, but it's got to be consistent money so that providers, can know that like that's going to be there, and then I can then lose the workforce when that money disappears.
Dan, are there any examples in other states that you are seeing of innovative approaches to strengthening the current workforce and the pipeline?
Yeah, there definitely are, Liz. But I think, and I'm happy to talk about other states. But before I do, I really want to talk for a minute about North Carolina, because I think it is important, that this audience know that North Carolina has been a leader in early childhood in the nation for decades. But I think, even on this front, there are some great things that have happened, and I want to give credit to Ariel and to Secretary Cohen and Susan Perry at North Carolina DHHS. North Carolina, for example, was the first state in the nation during the pandemic to provide bonus pay for the childcare workers who were required to be providing service as first responders during a contagious pandemic, through which they've had by and large no sort of employer compensated healthcare benefits, or even something as simple as a paid sick day during this time. So, I think great credit to North Carolina for stepping out there. And I actually credit North Carolina very much in helping to drive that conversation in the country. They were the first to step out on that ledge, and other states followed. And I think the great credit to the state is deserved there. I think the wages program and the TEACH program that Ariel mentioned, that are kind of homegrown in North Carolina and now nationally recognized, are so critical. And I think one other example of something that's exciting to me on the compensation front in North Carolina, Governor Cooper has incorporated, as part of his executive budget request, sort of a salary parity line item for the North Carolina pre-K program that would help to close the gap between what providers of North Carolina pre-K are paid in school districts and what they are provided, what that workforce makes in private and community-based settings in that mixed delivery system. So, some really important things happening in compensation in North Carolina. I do think that, nationally, there are some, a couple of notable things that are happening right now. There is a bill moving in progress right now in Massachusetts that would charge their Department of Early Childhood Education with creating individual retirement accounts for family childcare providers, and also then potentially sort of providing the employer match, if you will, to those retirement accounts. That's a really innovative way of looking at a much needed gap. The state of Washington has recently passed something called the Fair Start for Kids Act, components of which are going to start to look at how the state might help to support compensation, but also how it might help to support healthcare benefits for child care providers. I think, during the pandemic, we saw New Mexico kind of take a lead on making sure, at least as related to pandemic-related healthcare costs, that child care providers were not going to be left in a lurch. And so Governor Lujan Grisham basically announced a policy whereby child care providers who were infected with COVID, starting about a year ago, would have the opportunity, if they had no other access to healthcare benefits, to be able to access them through the state's high-risk insurance pool. And then, I think broadly, this is a topic that states are looking at, in part, thanks, by the way, to philanthropic efforts as well. The Alliance for Early Success right now, for example, is working on a big project called Child Care Next, which has been soliciting proposals from states for kind of transformative ideas in childcare. So we're in the process of kind of working through those proposals. But I think there's a lot of momentum in the states, and the multi-billion-dollar question right now is sort of how how states and how comfortable states will be, using those American Rescue Plan dollars, to really make transformative changes when it comes to the workforce. I think, I think Ariel and Celia both have provided really important sort of perspectives. Ariel sort of, echoing what I'm hearing from a lot of really smart state leaders around this, this is this moment, and we have these resources, and this is the opportunity to gather proof points for why this is important, and to evaluate and to be able to go back to Congress and say, look, as a result of the rescue plan, we did X, Y, and Z. This is what we saw in terms of how it influenced things like employee retention, for example. And so, I think there is a really active conversation in the states around, what can we do that's bold, and how can we measure and prove it? And at the same time, because we say that the Hunt Institute kind of works at the intersection of policy and politics. I would also, though, echo some of Celia's cautions that, if you are a governor who is running for re-election in 2024, in on a practical sense, it is very unlikely that you are going to be signing up for the opportunity to preside over a massive cut to the workforce's wages in 2024 as well. So I think there's it's this constant push and pull, which is the case in policy broadly. But I think that the time is right. The momentum is there. People are talking about this, and maybe just to sort of close the loop on these questions around what is the outlook for the American Families Plan, and what is the outlook for making changes based on the Leandro case. I mean, I think one of the things that I would point to is early childhood, more than ever, is a bipartisan issue. I think the polling data we have from voters across the country shows that regardless of your partisan affiliation, investments in young children are wildly popular. And so, there's lots of room on both sides of the aisle to embrace this issue, and lots, frankly, for, regardless of your political ideology, lots to like about early childhood, whether it's, whether it appeals to you because of the economic benefits and the long-term savings to taxpayers, or on the children and families side. I really think there is something for everyone. And so, I'm encouraged in North Carolina, for example, that, we played a role in helping to support the launch of a new early childhood caucus, which is both bipartisan and bicameral. And so, there are great legislative leaders from both sides of the aisle who are working on this issue in North Carolina. I think that is true at the federal level. Though, I mean, I think, unfortunately, the politics at the federal level in some cases can be even more toxic than elsewhere. I think there's lots of reason for bipartisan support, though. Sometimes there may be a temptation to oppose something simply because of who proposed it and who is advocating for it. But I'm hopeful that if there's any place, both in North Carolina and federally, that we can find some common ground here over the coming year, really is early childhood.
Thank you. I hear you saying that there is bipartisan momentum across the country around these issues, and as policymakers on both sides of the aisle, grapple with these big challenges, and as public investment in early learning potentially increases, how can we ensure that funding, as well as our policies, are equitable, are serving children and families who historically have the least access to high quality early learning? Ariel, if you'd like to jump in and start.
Yeah, I think, what immediately came to mind around that is that people like me need to be held accountable for disaggregated data. So we need to be able to show that, children in one county or one community of a county have access to infant care, for instance, because we know, if you actually kind of break it down by age, there's not a huge shortage of 3 and 4-year-old care kind of writ large. There is a crisis around infant and toddler care. So I think holding people like me, holding our states accountable for disaggregate the data. And for many of us, that means that we need to make investments in our data systems because they were developed, as Celia said, kind of at a time where we didn't know what we needed to know. And many of them don't have that capability to do that. So I think figuring out how we start to measure actual impact on families and communities using a data-driven approach is kind of a step one. And I think step two is I believe firmly that numbers and stories have to match or something's wrong. So if a community has great access to infant and toddler care, for instance, but you are talking to parents who have babies and they're like, I can't find a place to put my baby. There's a mismatch, right? And so is it that the infant care is not situated in a geographic area that makes sense for the family? Is it that the infant care is not meeting a cultural or linguistic need of the family? And so I think that while we have to have data systems collecting the hard data, the numbers and the quantitative data, we also have to have that qualitative piece and to listen to the stories of people and how it's really working in their community. So I guess those would be my kind of like above the fold recommendations, is that hold us accountable and that people like me need to start thinking about data both in stories and numbers. That'll get us a step closer, right? And then I would also just put another plug in for the workforce, that we can't get to an equitable system if we aren't investing equitably in our workforce. We have us in North Carolina, our workforce is about 51% people of color, almost exclusively women, whereas the K-12 workforce is about 80% white. So when we think about equity and we think about compensation, that the average wage of a childcare provider in North Carolina is about $12 an hour versus about $50,000 a year for a K-12 teacher. It's pretty inequitable, right? So that's what I would say is kind of get us to be very transparent about data, knowing that we're going to have to do some work to get there. That's not a light switch. And then really, equity doesn't work if we don't figure out workforce compensation, pay parity, period.
Thank you. I will be asking you questions and requesting that disaggregated data whenever it is a reality. Celia, is there anything that comes to mind just around like potential, I heard you say earlier that we need more money in the system, period, to kind of break this cycle of this model that isn't working. Do you have any thoughts around, I guess, financial and policy solutions that are equitable?
Well, I think I'm just going to piggyback on something Ariel said, because it is, the equity at the local level is where the rubber meets the road. And I think something else we learned through the pandemic, North Carolina was definitely in better shape than others. As I mentioned, I was working for a large national childcare company before, so I got a lens on 40 states during the pandemic. And let me tell you, it was varied. And North Carolina was definitely ahead. There are a number of states who couldn't even tell you where their providers were opened or not. They had no data system to pull that. But again, like one of the just the crucial things on the equity is you have to look at it at the most minute local level, because when you get up into the large numbers, you are missing huge swaths. So on the equity and with the money, the money is important, but again, if it's not sent to the places where it is most needed, then again, you've missed the boat. And I would hope going forward, as we try to think about childcare, it's really important that states and localities remain a very central role in that, because the federal government just doesn't have the lens to know what's going on in a local community. I will never forget, when I was working for Richard the last time, I got a call from the Atlanta Regional Head Start office. And I'd had to have a conversation with them because Head Start had tried to consolidate 2 programs in a mountain county in North Carolina. And the regional office didn't think there was any issue with this whatsoever, because on a map, they only looked to be 10 miles apart. The problem was that 10 miles was switchback. And the regional office was like, well, you just put the kids on the van or the bus and we'll get them over there. And I was like, that's 10 miles of switchback in the winter. And I'm having this conversation with my landlord. They're like, what's a switchback? I said, well, maybe you can meet me in Avery County and we can drive this road together. And if you get as nauseous as I get with all the hairpin turns, you will understand why this community is quite upset that like you've tried to consolidate and it doesn't work for their needs. And that's where looking at where the gaps are in infant toddler care, where they are in the local community. Is it that they can't afford, or is it that they can't get there, or the hours don't work? I mean, all of those elements we need to look at. And I think we have learned from the pandemic, and hopefully going forward, we'll take much more granular analysis of what's going on to meet with local communities and meet their needs, because what is Avery County's needs is going to be very different, most likely, from Wake County or Mecklenburg County. But even within Mecklenburg County or Wake County, we have pockets of kind of rural within that you have to think even within there, like in that very little, that neighborhood community may not be what it is in the central part of the city.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have tons of amazing questions from our folks listening in. And so I'm going to move to some of those. Thank you so much. And I'll try to get to as many as possible. The first one that came in is, could the panelists address how children with special needs are being served during this moment? I know that there is, the early intervention side of things that you guys have touched on a little bit. Is there anything that you guys can add as far as, how children with special needs are being served and how they might be better served?
I'm happy to jump in, but Ariel, I didn't know if you wanted to say something about North Carolina.
Well, I think, I'll start, I guess. I think the pandemic was super hard for early intervention. I mean, when you have little ones who are getting physical therapy and you can't be in person, that makes it really tough. And so I don't know that, I don't think I can say that went super well writ large. I guess the one thing I can say we have learned is that in the absence of those kinds of in-person events, is that that connection with family has grown much tighter, right? Because then whoever the caregiver is, if it's grandmama or whoever, becomes that physical therapist by proxy, right? So she is on Zoom with the physical therapist and working through the developmental progressions for that child. So I think it's been really hard for families with children with disability. Now, families with children who have special medical healthcare needs, those were still being met, and it maybe looked a little bit different, but those families were still able to access services. So it was other kinds of intervention services that looked different this year. And I think we're starting to move back toward a more traditional service delivery model. But I really think families stepped up to the plate, and that was a huge burden. I mean, we heard story after story of families really, and meme after meme of kind of funny things, but also just families really having to figure out, how do I really do this without any of the traditional ways? So I want to thank the listener for raising that question. And sometimes it is easy for us to not talk about children with disabilities and the intervention services that we do and should be providing. And I think there's some lessons that we need to really unpack from how we make sure that we have a comprehensive plan that doesn't always look like a traditional service plan for children with disabilities. So that's what's top of mind for me. Dan, I'll let you.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Ariel said. I think it was, as with many things, a real mixed bag that, varied very much by individual circumstances. But I do think that there were, in some ways, actually some silver linings of the pandemic when it comes to early intervention, in particular. As in a prior role, I had the opportunity to oversee the delivery of South Carolina's early intervention services. And one of the things that states struggle really mightily with, particularly in rural areas, is access to the kinds of professionals necessary to help support families, that there aren't necessarily an abundance of speech language therapists or occupational therapists in the most rural communities around the country. And so one of the things that I do think the pandemic actually has done to help the nation's early intervention system is to accelerate the use of the kind of telemedicine model, where we're using more things like Zoom and FaceTime and those sorts of ways of accessing. One of the exciting things to me about that is, if you think about the different elements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act at the federal level, when you think about older children, those in the education community are used to the term IEP, right, an individualized education plan. Well, in early childhood, particularly with infants and toddlers, the focus there is really not on the individual plan. It is a family service plan, and one of the things that I think is sort of sometimes missed, particularly in early intervention, because there is a sort of a Venn diagram of education and health where those services overlap, is that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that the early intervention programs around the country are delivered basically as part of special education. It is ultimately an education program, and it is really not designed to be a situation where a therapist is coming in and just working with the child. The idea in early intervention settings ideally ought to be that the therapist is, as much as anything, working with the families to help them understand the kinds of things that they should be doing with their children. And so, I do think that technology has probably helped. I've heard kind of anecdotally, how technology has helped to get parents engaged in new ways. The same, incidentally, holds true of home visiting programs. I have a friend who runs a home visiting program, and 6 or 8 months ago, I said to her, "Gosh, this must be catastrophic for your program now that you're not able to make your home visits." And she said, "No, actually, just the opposite is true. We have, we're making these visits, we're doing them virtually, but we're getting so many more people involved, that maybe have a greater comfort with connecting, and rather than if it were me, I'd be worried just because my kitchen would be messy on that particular day." So allowing those kind of technological connections may in some ways have helped to strengthen some of our programs as well.
Thank you, Dan. So we are going to have time to do all of the questions. So I'm just kind of like randomly picking. And I think this one kind of gets at a lot of the larger issues we've discussed today. And this listener asks, do you think childcare will be federally funded, and I guess publicly funded, like the public school system one day? I have earned degrees through Teach and Wages, and teachers can only find work in the public school to live on. What are your thoughts? Anyone who'd like to jump in?
Go ahead, Celia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna say in terms of like federally funded, in many ways it already is to an extent similarly funded. I mean, the way that the Child Care Development Block Grant, the subsidy program, is allocated to the states currently is based on a factor of the number of young children in the state and a poverty factor. Ironically, North Carolina receives its far better share of federal funding under CCDBG than it does under Title I for K-12, because that formula is based. More of the money is going to places where kids no longer live because of states that don't want to relinquish funds, as there's been movement historically from the Northeast and Midwest to the Southeast and Southwest. That said, obviously it's not been funded anywhere near the level than we have seen for either Title I, or for that matter, Head Start. Head Start serves a far smaller number of children in a given year, but Head Start pulls down a much larger number of dollars in any given year than childcare does. But I think we're going to see a continuation of similar. Like I think with the federal, it will be some type of formula based. It's based on number of people, depending on what age range we set. And a poverty factor. And I'll let Dan and Ariel take the next part of the question.
I saw the questioner was offering some clarification in the chat. I think I would say two things about this. I do think that we are moving to a place where it is well recognized that the childcare market in particular is what economists call a broken market, right? That this, I think, increasingly is something that we recognize as a public good. And so I do think that we are likely to move over time to a place where there is more and more public funding in the way that school districts are funded. But I would want to clarify that what that does not necessarily equate to is the provision of early childhood services moving into the public school system. And I think that actually, that gets back to our whole the devil is in the details issue around things like the American Families Plan. I think there is ample evidence for us at this point that an expansion of pre-K programs, for example, really has to be done and has to be done in a way that really foregrounds private and community-based providers in a way that does not threaten, for example, the availability of infant toddler care. The economics of the child care model are such that it is virtually impossible, if not impossible, for most providers to turn any sort of profit or even break even on infant toddler care, just because of the ratios and the very small number of kids involved per adult. And so the childcare businesses rely very heavily on the larger groups of older preschoolers to sort of balance the books and keep them in operation. So yes, I think there'll be more public funding, potentially that we could move toward more of a publicly subsidized early childhood system, but I think, probably not a reason to fear that it gets sort of sucked up into the public school system.
So I'm going to jump in, if that's okay, Liz.
Please.
And I want to start by saying thank you to the listener for getting your degree. That is so amazing. I went back to school as a grown-up, and it's really, really hard. And I didn't have little children at home, so I don't know your living situation, but thank you for taking advantage of the TEACH program and getting your degree. I think that's just super awesome. So that's number one. I guess number two, I would say, to echo some of what Dan was talking through, there's something really special and magical that I don't want us to lose in the early childhood system. And that's that there are local programs in communities that have raised 2 and 3 generations of babies. And they are community institutions. And so I think that we are going to, as a field, and this is kind of inside the early childhood tent, our field will need to figure out and grapple with, how do we have a mixed delivery system that prioritizes care in communities by people that we love and trust who have, quality programming, and how we have enough public support to make that viable. And I will just put in another plug here to say that I think a conversation that is just beginning that we need to really kind of lean into is, in our private businesses, how do we ensure that those businesses have the structures to support compensation as more federal dollars come in? And that's a touchy conversation. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that we have the right answers today, but it's time for us to do that. So I would say it's a yes and. And the listener is saying that you're one class away from a doctorate in early childhood. Oh my goodness. Okay. Congratulations. I will stop.
Yes, I will echo that from Ariel. Congratulations to Lori. Shouts out Lori. let's do one more audience question. If you guys could just be speedy through your answers on this one. And it is similarly to, they were adding on to the first question around children with special needs being served, but they asked, how are multilingual children being served? And I think that's come up in bits and pieces around, how can early childhood services meet the cultural and linguistic needs of the children and families they serve? What are you guys hearing from the field, and how can, we support linguistic, match between educators and children?
I would just say from my experience, this is broadly in the last couple of years visiting centers across the US, there's still a great deal more support we need to give to centers and family childcare providers on this, but they are doing an amazing job with children in their local communities. Now, I have been in centers where you have got, in a 3-year-old classroom, 15 languages going around. And those teachers are making it work for every single child and family member in there. And one of the things that's so unique about early childhood and different than K-12 is that every morning at drop off, every evening at pickup, there is a parent center or provider interaction that occurs. They are so much more attuned to family needs than in K-12, where a child is kind of dropped off at the curb, you wave goodbye and move on. But again, that said, I know we need to do a great deal more of support, but I think there's an incredible community base to work with in early childhood that is very unique than that which is sitting in K-12.
I'd add, I think our systems are behind our communities, and that communities are responding to families, and we are playing catch up. And so that's part, Liz, when we get the systems and you start asking me, that's one of the things that we need to start understanding better is, who is able to serve bilingual or multilingual children and families, who is already doing that, what are the supports that we need to put into place. And so I think, we're playing catch up to the realities of our communities that have already said, these are our babies and we're going to take care of them. And they're doing it in beautiful, beautiful ways. So thank y'all to communities for taking care of the babies.
Thank you all. And, I am wondering if each of you would like to just add in any final thoughts to close us out. Thank you again, Smart Start, for this excellent discussion. And you can find my early childhood coverage at ednc.org. Also sign up for Early Bird. I write a bi-weekly early childhood newsletter, and you can find it at ednc.org. Sorry, just had to do a little plug there. Do each of you guys have a couple closing thoughts today? Dan, do you want to start?
I'm happy to, and I will likewise put in a plug for Liz's coverage and for Early Bird. I think to Amy's comments earlier, Liz, the state of North Carolina really is very lucky to have Education NC fulfilling the role that it is, and frankly to have you as a dedicated reporter in early childhood. I have the opportunity to deal with media at a national level routinely, and it's just it is always a treat to speak with someone in journalism who knows the issues of early childhood as well as you do. So congratulations and thank you for all the good work that you do. Just in closing, I would mention, again, I think we're at an inflection point in the field. We've had a year and a half worth of pandemic. We've had a year and a half's worth. There's nothing that sort of illustrates the value of something like having it suddenly disappear, the way that in parts of the country childcare did. So I think we're at this place. We've got bipartisan support. I think we've got better understanding by the community, maybe in part because of the pandemic, of the importance of these issues. We've got the resources in place, and so now it is really just incumbent on all of us who are working in the policy realm to help make sure that new policies are enacted thoughtfully. I think to listeners, I would encourage you to keep an eye on these policies and to continue to be an advocate for just for, no policy in particular, but for, for things that are going to move forward the needs of young children and families in your states and in your communities. I just think we're at a special place, and shame on us if we don't seize the opportunity.
Thank you to Smart Start, and Liz, thank you to you for hosting this conversation with us. And I guess I want to speak to the young leaders on the call and to say, if you are a young person who is interested in early childhood policy, if you have come from the field, it's important to me that we raise up leadership from our diverse, amazing field. And so I am so proud of you and so encouraged by you. I get Facebook messages or emails, and I'm really proud of what's happening across communities and in the field. So to our young leaders, thank you. Let's do this together. Let's hold hands and walk forward. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
And I will just echo everything Dan and Ariel said, and to thank Smart Start for this, and to thank all of you in North Carolina for everything you have done the last year. As I mentioned, I had a bird's eye view of 40 some states over the last year. And I was never so proud to be a North Carolinian than to watch North Carolina's response during this pandemic, because it was exceptional. And it showed what years of building a system in a quality, methodical, thoughtful way get you. And I have great hope and optimism for what North Carolina will do to build upon that which works wonderfully, to address those issues that don't, to build an even better, stronger, that meets all of the needs of our children, our families, employers, and all the residents of North Carolina. So thank you all.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists, and a special thanks to Liz Bell for being with us as our moderator today. Great job, everybody. That was a really rich discussion, and I know that our participants learned a lot. Those who attended today, thanks for your great questions. We appreciated those, and be on the lookout for surveys to give your feedback on this session and the rest of the conference. Also, come back and join us May 27th, when we'll be delving even more deeply into the workforce issues and how we can support both compensation and education of the workforce. So we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you, everyone. Have a great day.